Hello and welcome to Music Tech for Music Teachers. Today we're going to be talking all about microphones. Let's jump in. All right, let's talk about microphones. A microphone's job. What is a microphone doing? So the whole point of a microphone is to take sound, which we know to be vibrations in the air, and turn it into electrical pulses. We are translating a natural phenomenon into a different natural phenomenon, electricity. So we're not even worrying about their ability to record. We're just worrying about a microphone's ability to translate. And that translation is just into electrical pulses. There's a couple different ways to do this and a couple different types of microphones we can look at. So the first one we're going to look at here is condenser microphones. They're one of the oldest microphone designs. They're still very popular. They tend to have the largest amount of frequencies that they will respond to. They consist of a vibrating diaphragm and crystal electrodes. So basically, there's this diaphragm that has an electrode charging it. The diaphragm has these two metal sheets that's got crystals in between it. And as that diaphragm vibrates, the electrode that's sending power into that diaphragm, the crystals get kind of compressed, and that changes the capacitance, the amount of electricity that they can contain. And as that capacitance changes, it generates a wave that comes out of your microphone, and that's what you get. So in order to run a condenser microphone, you need that consistent source of power to go to that electrode, which then gets sent into the diaphragm. We call this phantom power. And it's because you don't need to plug a condenser microphone separately into the wall and then have an audio line coming out of it. There is a way to send this power through an XLR cable or through a USB cable if you're using a USB microphone into the microphone, the same cable that would be having the audio signal come out of it, which is nice. There's usually a little switch on your audio interface or on your mixing board. It'll often be labeled phantom power. It may be labeled 48V, or it may be labeled like 12 to 18V, and we'll talk about that in just a second when we talk about electret condensers. But most of the time it'll say 48V. That's going to be your most useful phantom power. So the two types, you have polarized condensers and electret condensers. Polarized are the most common ones. Both of these microphones that we see here on the screen are polarized condenser microphones. Electret condensers are used a lot for cheap, low-quality microphones. There are some companies that make like high-end electret condensers, and they are still a little bit cheaper than polarized microphones, and they will work very well. Audio-Technica is one of those brands that makes electret condensers that are more well-rounded in their frequency responses and designed more for musical usage. But most of the time, electret condensers go into like CB radio handles. If you anything that's going to sound like this, that's really what most electret condensers sound like. The polarized are used most for recordings. Then beyond that, we're going to talk about large diaphragm and small diaphragm condensers. That microphone on the left is a Neumann U87. It's a very famous large diaphragm condenser mic. It's used on 1,000 different recordings and more than that, truthfully. A large diaphragm tends to be the default if you're going to buy your first condenser microphone. They have a really good signal-to-noise ratio, which means that as you turn it up, you will like pick up more sound, but every sound device has some, we call it a noise floor, where it generates some noise just by the virtue of the fact that it's an electrical device and it makes sound. So as you turn some other microphones up, you'll get a lot of this kind of, it almost sounds like wind, electronic wind blowing that comes in, and it kind of ruins your sound because it'll record just like everything else and it'll amplify just like everything else. You don't have to turn your preamp gain up very high to get good and complete pickup out of a large diaphragm condenser microphone. That's not the case with other microphones, but they have a really, they tend to be quiet, as we call them, even though they pick up sound quite loudly. The microphone itself and the way that it'll react to a preamp is quiet. And they have a very round, not necessarily round per se, but they have a very broad frequency response. They pick up a lot of low end and they can pick up a lot of high end. Small diaphragm condensers like the one on the right, that's a Neumann KM54. Another very famous small diaphragm condenser. They'll also often be called pencil condensers. They have a more responsive and detailed high end for picking up transients. A transient is the moment that a sound starts. So if I am hitting a snare drum and it goes ka, the k is the transient. That moment that the sound kicks into being, it tends to be considerably louder than the rest of the sound. So small diaphragms are very popular for percussion. They get used a lot to mic up cymbals when you really want articulation and not just wash from your cymbals. They get used a lot for the underside of snare drums if you want to capture more of the rattle of the snare. People will use them for all kinds of things, though. People will use them for vocals sometimes, and on the right voice, that's a great choice. A large diaphragm is going to be the most common type that you'll see, but small diaphragms or pencils are also very common. All right, the next type we have is a dynamic microphone. These are the ones you're going to see most often in your school music programs, used for like live sound applications. This is because they're extremely durable. They can handle really high sound pressure levels. They're usually built in metal casings, and then the actual mechanism that makes them function is just a coil of wire wrapped around a magnet. It's pretty hard to truthfully create a fault in that system. The downside is that they do not have as wide of a frequency response as condenser microphones. They also require a lot more gain from your preamp to pick up sound, which means that their noise floor is higher. So your signal to noise ratio usually isn't as good as it is with a condenser microphone. But they can handle so much SPL that if you're miking up something that's already loud, you probably don't even need that much gain, and you're not going to have to worry about that signal to noise ratio, and you're not going to damage your microphone. That one there on the left is the Shure Sm58. It is the golden standard for dynamic vocal microphones. That metal windscreen on there is really great at stopping like P sounds and B sounds, things that will make a microphone pop. And then its cousin there, the Shure Sm57, is basically the exact same microphone without the metal windscreen. In fact, if you took that metal windscreen, it just screws right off the Sm58. You basically have an Sm57. They're more popular for instruments because they have all of the same components and they're just as rugged. But instruments don't have issues with plosives in the letter P and the letter B because most instruments don't make those sounds. So you can get really close to an instrument, closer than you could with that metal windscreen on, and you get a really nice sound in a very rugged microphone that can handle a lot of SPL. Our third type that we're going to talk about is ribbon microphones. Ribbon microphones are a very old design. There's very few companies that still make them to this day. As music educators, you are not very likely to deal with any ribbon microphones unless you happen to be working out of an old school that just has some ribbon microphones. It would be shocking to me if they survived, but I think it's still important that you know about ribbon microphones. So they're electromagnetic, just like dynamic microphones are, so they do require more preamp gain. They function that you have two magnets with a metal wire or ribbon running between them, and as you sing into them or expose them to a sound source, that sound makes that ribbon vibrate between the two magnets, and that's what generates the pulse. They do not pick up a lot of high end and articulation. People love to describe this as warm or vintage, and on the right voice they absolutely sound fantastic because some voices will have a lot of high end energy to the point where it becomes grating on the ears. Some instruments sound really good recorded on ribbon microphones. Some people like to use ribbon microphones for drum overheads because they'll still get some of the articulation if you have really bright cymbals, but they won't necessarily be piercingly bright. Warm and vintage just so you know, are buzzwords that pro audio use to refer to a really smooth high end or a reduced high end in some way, not having so much high end frequencies that it pierces your ears. They are extremely fragile. That metal ribbon that runs between the two magnets is very thin. You could likely break it just by running your finger across it. So they can't even really handle that much SPL. It's not a good idea to use a ribbon microphone on the snare drum if someone's going to be playing really loud. It's not a good idea to use it on a guitar amplifier that's going to be turned up all the way. And if you plug it into a mixer while phantom power is on, like phantom power is on, and then that's when you decide to plug in your microphone, you could ruin your microphone forever. Because the ribbon microphone is not wanting to see that phantom power, and you could end up shorting out the microphone by sending that current through it. If your ribbon microphone is already plugged in, it's okay to turn on phantom power because it's already plugged in, but do not plug in a ribbon microphone while phantom power is on. And they are consistently in what we call a figure 8 polar pattern. And we're going to talk about polar patterns right now. So the first polar pattern we're going to talk about is cardioid. It's kind of shaped like a heart. You can see there in the diagram, the black line within that grid there, the spider web, more so than a grid. So we can see that the area within that black line is where the sound gets picked up, and we're imagining that the microphone is pointing down. So a cardioid microphone rejects the information from behind it very strongly. You see it comes all the way down to the center of that sound source. Right behind it, it just rejects that sound. And it picks up what's right in front of it very clearly. But it does not go that far in front. They are not a good polar pattern to use from super far away because they do not reject incredibly strongly from the sides. The further away you go from a source, the more noise from the sides you're going to introduce in the way or in between those, in between your sound source and the microphone. Some people prefer an off-axis sound, which means you point the microphone at the sound source and then you tilt it slightly to one side or the other, and that will create a situation where you lose a little bit of the high end. You sometimes lose a little bit of the low end too, and some people really like that sound, and it's an interesting way to play with if a sound is too aggressive. If you go just a little bit off axis, it will help make the sound less aggressive. Next polar pattern we're going to talk about is hypercardioid. It is a lot like cardioid, but with stronger side axis rejection. So you'll see that it actually picks up just a little bit behind it, and it picks up really strongly in front, but there's that pocket on the side that was totally being picked up on a cardioid mic that is now being completely rejected. They're popular used in what we call shotgun mics. You'll see them on like television sets. They get used a lot for video because you need your microphone to be out of the video shot while you are on camera, and you need to be able to pick up from a distance. And so since you're picking up from a distance, you want more of that side rejection, so you're just getting what you're pointing at. That makes hypercardioid really good. You need to know what it is, even though it's not typically used in a musical context, because some microphones that you may see may have a switch for hypercardioid, and you may be in a situation where you really need side rejection more than back rejection. And that's how you get it. Two more polar patterns. We have figure 8. Figure 8 is exactly what it sounds like. It picks up really strong in front, picks up just as good in back, and it rejects stuff from the side. Every ribbon mic works this way. They're really good for room microphones. If you're just going to mic up a whole room, it can be really nice to use a ribbon mic, especially if you're going to use it to emulate ears, because your ears kind of point to the side, right? So if you put a figure 8 microphone in a room, as though each side of that microphone was an ear listening, you'll get a really interesting result, and you'll pick up some really interesting content, and it might even just be a little bit more natural to a listener who might be listening in headphones. Our last one here is omnidirectional, and that is basically it has an element in it that picks up sound, and it's going to just pick up all the sound. Every sound. You cannot see the pattern written on that spider web because it's just the whole circle. It picks up everything from every direction. They have very broad frequency responses because they're not designed to tune out any frequencies or any directions, and so you just have less in the way. They're good for picking up whole groups. Sometimes you can get like an entire... It's very popular in bluegrass to use an omnidirectional microphone to record, because if you are in an ensemble and you only have one microphone to record with, you can put that microphone in the center of the room and position your ensemble around it. People can step forward to take a solo. You have that whole space around the microphone to work with for spatial balancing. They also do not suffer from what we call the proximity effect, and I'm going to demonstrate the proximity effect in a couple of slides, but you should know that omnidirectional microphones are not susceptible to it. Now, they are not good for amplification. They're great for recording, but when you're trying to amplify something, they're very prone to feedback because they're not designed to reject any sound. So if you are speaking into the microphone, that sound is then coming out of a speaker. Ideally, that speaker is not pointed at your microphone. If you take a dynamic microphone and you point it directly at the speaker that has the sound coming out of it, the sound goes into the microphone, out of the speaker, into the microphone, out of the speaker. You create this loop, and that's where you get that really loud screech or woof or whatever you want to call the sound that comes out of the speaker. It's just a loop. It goes into the mic, out of the speaker, into the mic, out of the speaker, and there's no way to break it unless you remove that mic from the situation or you turn the speaker off. So omnidirectional microphones are going to be especially prone to that because they don't reject any sound. So it doesn't matter which way you point the microphone. If the speaker is close enough, it's going to be a problem. Microphone technology. So we're going to talk about some technological terms that get used in microphones, just so you know what they are. The first one is dynamic range. Dynamic range, in short, is the difference between the loudest and the softest sound. So in almost any given orchestral piece, your dynamic range is going to be quite a bit wider than in rock music. Even if rock music is louder, your dynamic range is greater in an orchestra because you can go in an instant from having your whole orchestra playing to a single flute solo in pianissimo. All of that being controlled by a conductor. Things can go up and down very quickly. You would have a really high dynamic range. Rock music, I mean, most of your instruments are being amplified, and that kind of puts a bass level on as quiet as you can go. And you're competing with a drummer, and in rock music, the drummer's usually playing pretty loud. So you wouldn't have as much dynamic range. What we want when we're engaging with a microphone is a dynamic range that will capture the amount of sound and dynamic range that we're making without getting broken during the loudest parts. So when we use dynamic microphones, get used a lot for rock and roll music performance because all of those sound sources are so loud and they tend to have a pretty consistent volume about them. So you can set that gain where you need it to be and walk away and know that it's probably not going to get out of hand. Well, with an orchestra, you have a higher dynamic range, but you're not likely to be exceeding that threshold of loudness that a microphone can handle. So condenser microphones tend to be better in orchestral settings than dynamics because a dynamic microphone might not pick up your pianissimo flute solo very well at all. A condenser will still get that and may be able to set still with low enough gain that when your big timpani hits come in, you're not going to have an issue. Other things we want to do to avoid noise. I talked a little bit about signal to noise ratio. Your signal is your sound, and noise will come from the preamp or the microphone. And you want to make sure that your signal is just as much louder than your noise as it can be. Some ways to make sure that happens. If you have short cable runs, you avoid all of the noise that cables can introduce to your system. Cables can work like antennas sometimes and pick up electromagnetic interference from lights, from being run near power cables, from being near other electronics. They can pick up hum and buzz. So the shorter your cables, the less noise you're going to introduce into your system. Microphones will also sometimes come with a pad switch. It'll say minus 20 dB or minus 10 dB. And basically, that decreases your microphone's sensitivity, so it will require a little bit more gain to be as loud. But if you're using a really loud sound source, that can help you to not break your microphone or cause distortion in the sound when you make a really loud noise and your microphone can't handle it. You want to be aware of a microphone's maximum SPL. You can always look up the model of microphone you're using and max SPL on Google, and you'll see what it is. And you can kind of get a feel for which microphones are designed to handle more loud sounds and which ones are designed to handle more of the nuanced and quieter sounds. You also want to take a look at microphone technique. There is this dirty habit that I've seen from a lot of traditional music educators, and it's fine. I'm sure they all learned it from one wrong person, and that was great, but it's got to stop. I've seen a lot of vocal coaches tell their singer students when they're holding something like an SM58 or a dynamic vocal microphone that they should keep one hand's distance in between their voice and the microphone. This would be a totally appropriate distance on a condenser microphone, but on a dynamic microphone, it's a terrible idea. You want your baseline volume and where your gain is set to be okay while your singer is as close to that microphone as they can get, almost making lip contact with the microphone itself. And this has to do a little bit with the proximity effect. And it also has to do with the fact that when we're amplifying sound live, we want to be able to give it enough gain to get loud without having enough gain that it's going to start picking up the sound from the speakers and causing feedback. The further away we are from the microphone, the more opportunity we give that excess sound to come in from the sides and even from the front if it's bouncing off a wall to cause that feedback. So if the closer you stay to the mic, the less gain you have to give it to pick you up. And then only on the very loudest passages would you need to back that microphone off an inch or two from your face. And it's going to be a little bit different with everybody's voices. But in general, you want to stay close to a dynamic microphone. Really close. And I will show you why right now, because we're going to talk about the last thing, or the second to last thing here, the proximity effect. Basically, it's a phenomenon in which the closer you get to a microphone, the more low end it's going to demonstrate. Now, this is not the case with omnidirectional microphones. They do not have a proximity effect issue. But most microphones you're going to be using will not be omnidirectional. So the closer you get to a microphone, the bassier your voice will be. So for an example, right now, my lips are basically touching the dynamic microphone that I'm speaking into. I have a nice rounded out quality in my voice, even though my particular voice is actually mostly high end. I do not have a very deep voice as far as the male voice goes. Now, I am going to back off one hand's distance away from this microphone. Are you ready? This is me one hand distance away from the microphone at the same volume. You'll notice the sound was just a lot thinner. It was so much thinner. And so you want to find the sweet spot, because you might be in a place where your voice is too bassy to be that close to a microphone, and so you need to back off a little bit. But that can have an effect on how you place your microphones. Be aware of the proximity effect. Plosives and popping, they make pop shields, pop filters, things that's, and all that they really are is something that gets in between your source and your microphone that's going to stop these large outbursts of air that are going to cause your microphone to be overloaded for a little bit, and really loud P's and B's. And so something you can do is honestly just put a finger up in between your voice and the microphone, and that will help disturb some of the large bursts of air. You can also use the high-pass filter, which is a function of equalization that basically cuts off the low frequencies in your signal because a lot of that rush of air is going to come across as low frequencies. There's also rumble. Anytime you have these low frequency vibrations that get transferred into a microphone, whether they move through the air or even through the microphone stand that they're attached to, that can create some unwanted noise. They make shock mounts and cradles, things that help decouple the microphone from the environment around it. You also just want to avoid like tapping on your microphone, because that's how you get a lot of that rumble. High-pass filters will also help you with rumble. The last thing we want to look about when using, especially when using multiple microphones, is phase relationship. So when a signal is generated in a cable, we visualize that signal as a wave with crests and troughs. And so if we have one microphone, it doesn't really matter how that wave is oriented. But let's say we have two different microphones on one snare drum. We have one on the top and one on the bottom. If we hit that snare drum and we see just like this blue wave goes up while the red wave goes down, that may be because one microphone is one distance away from the snare and the other is a different distance away from that snare. Which means that the sound is going to arrive at those microphones at two different times. So one wave may be completely inverted from the other wave. And if you do that and then you combine those waves together, what you get is phase cancellation. Neither one is going to make sound, even though the signal is traveling down to the speaker. They cancel themselves out. So you want to be mindful of that. You want to make sure that if you're ever using more than one microphone on a source, that the loudest and most important thing that you're recording within that source, that your two microphones, your three microphones, however many microphones you're using, they're all similar distances away from the snare. If you end up in a pickle and you can't quite adjust for the right space, there is often a phase reversal switch that you can find on your mixing board or your recording software, and play with that a little bit and see if you can kind of knock things back into phase with each other. So I hope you enjoyed learning about microphones. This has been Music Tech for Music Teachers, and I'll see you next time.